The warship died the way all great things die, loudly, and then in silence. Commander Vaelira Sorn felt the crown of ash shudder beneath her boots a full 2 seconds before the first explosion tore through the aft cannon deck. She had commanded starships long enough to know the difference between a hit that could be survived and one that could not, and this one, this rolling, groaning failure of steel and plasma conduit, was the second kind. "Brace!" She shouted down the corridor, though there was no one left to hear her. The evacuation klaxons had already gone silent, which meant either the crew had made it to the pods, or there was no one left alive to warn. She did not know yet which. The corridor buckled. The artificial gravity flickered, died, returned wrong, pulling sideways instead of down, and Vaelira was thrown into a bulkhead hard enough to crack 2 ribs beneath her silver-marked armor. She tasted blood. Somewhere above her, in the part of the ship that no longer technically existed, something enormous groaned and came apart. The last thing she remembered clearly was reaching for a support strut that wasn't there anymore, and then the world became a fist closing around her, and then nothing. When Vaelira woke, it was to darkness, and pain, and the particular metallic stink of a hull that had stopped being a ship and started being a tomb. She was on her back. Something heavy pinned her legs. A collapsed support beam, she realized, running her hands along it in the dark, still warm from the fires that must have burned somewhere nearby before the oxygen ran thin enough to smother them. Her ribs screamed when she breathed. Her right arm would not respond to her commands at all, which told her something about her shoulder that she did not want to think about yet. She was Cerithian. She had been trained since childhood to catalog her wounds without flinching, to set aside pain as a problem to be solved later, and so she did that now, beam across the legs, shoulder dislocated or worse, ribs cracked, blood loss unknown, air quality poor and worsening. She had perhaps 6 hours before the last of the emergency oxygen reserves in this section bled out into the vacuum beyond the hull breach she could hear hissing somewhere to her left. 6 hours to die in the dark, alone, in the wreckage of the ship she had commanded for 11 years. That was when she heard the voice. Hey, don't move, okay? Don't move. It was not a Cerithian voice. It was pitched wrong, rougher around the edges, and it spoke Cerithian with the flattened, careful accuracy of someone who had learned the language as an adult rather than been born into it. A light flared. Not a proper lumen, just the small chemical glow stick every field medic carried for exactly this situation, and in its sickly green light Vaelira saw a human face for the first time in her life from less than a foot away. He was young. Younger than her, certainly, with a jaw dusted in several days of stubble and a gash above one eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried there in a dark, ugly line. His uniform. Gray, unfamiliar, marked with symbols she vaguely recognized from Earth Coalition Medical Corps insignia, was torn at the shoulder. He was kneeling over her with both hands pressed to her side, and when she looked down she understood why. The ribs she had catalogued as cracked had, apparently, done considerably more damage than that on the way in. "You're a medic," she said. Her voice came out as a rasp. "Jonah Vail," he said, as though that answered a different question than the one she'd asked. "Field medic, Earth Coalition 3rd Fleet. Our shuttle got clipped by the same debris field that took out your ship. I don't." He glanced up, toward the ceiling, toward the hiss of escaping air. "I don't actually know where the rest of my crew ended up. I found you about 20 minutes ago. You're losing blood faster than I like." Vaelira looked at him. At his human hands, unarmored, shaking very slightly with either cold or fear or both, pressed hard against the wound in the body of the most feared commander in the Cerithian Dominion, and felt something she did not have a ready word for. "You should leave me," she said. "Find your own crew. A dying commander is not worth." "You're not dying," Jonah said in the flat, certain tone of a man who had decided something and did not intend to be argued out of it. "Not on my watch. Hold still." He did not leave. What followed was not a rescue. It was a siege, of time, of oxygen, of the slow erosion of two strangers' certainties about who the enemy was supposed to be. Jonah worked with what he had, which was very little, a field kit meant for human physiology, forced to improvise for a body with two hearts, unfamiliar clotting chemistry, and a skeletal structure denser than his scanner had ever been calibrated for. He set her shoulder back into its socket by feel alone, in the dark, while she bit down on a strip of torn fabric and did not scream, though he heard the breath tear out of her all the same. "You could have warned me," she said afterward, when she could speak again. "You'd have tensed up. Worse for the joint." He was checking her ribs again, hands careful, professional, and utterly without the deference she was accustomed to from those who served beneath her. "You're a commander. I figured you'd rather I just did it than talk you through being scared." "I was not scared." "Sure," Jonah said, and there was something almost like a smile in his voice, "there in the dark." "Neither was I, when I set my own arm 2 years ago on Kessel Station. Definitely wasn't scared then either." They rationed the water he carried, a single canteen, meant for one person for 1 day, now stretched across 2 people and an unknown number of days beyond that. He gave her the larger share without being asked and without announcing that he was doing it, which she noticed anyway, because noticing things was the reason she had survived 11 years of command. Beyond the walls of their small, collapsed pocket of the ship, the war continued without them. She heard, at intervals, the distant concussive thump of Cerithian patrol vessels sweeping the debris field, searching, she assumed, for survivors, or for salvage, or possibly for nothing at all, simply passing through on their way to somewhere the battle still mattered. Jonah went very still each time, and once, when the sound grew close enough that dust sifted down from the ceiling, he put himself bodily between her and the direction of the noise, as though his unarmored human body could do anything at all against the Cerithian warship's scanners. "That's foolish," she told him, the 3rd time it happened. "Probably," he agreed, and did not move. By the end of the first day, her wounds had stabilized under his care, but a new problem had begun to make itself known, one Jonah's medical training had no framework for at all, because it was not, strictly speaking, medical. Vaelira could not sleep. It was not insomnia in the human sense, not restlessness, not an inability to quiet the mind. It was refusal, deep and absolute, older than her own memory. She had been raised on the doctrine every Cerithian warrior learned before they learned to walk, that consciousness was the shield of the soul, and sleep was the moment that shield came down. The Dominion's ancient dead, the soldiers lost across 1,000 years of war, the spirits the old texts called the unrest, waited in the space behind closed eyes for exactly that moment of surrender, and they did not wait kindly. Elite warriors like Vaelira trained their entire lives to need almost no rest at all, and what little they took was always chemically controlled, always brief, always guarded by armed sentries standing watch over their bodies while their souls were, theoretically, vulnerable. She had no sentries here. She had no chemical regulator, lost somewhere in the wreckage along with the rest of her equipment. She had only exhaustion, deep and total, pulling at her like a tide. And beneath it, a fear she would have died before admitting to any of her own officers. By the 2nd day, her hands had begun to shake from sheer sleep deprivation compounding blood loss. Jonah noticed. Of course he noticed. It was his entire profession to notice things like this, and he asked her about it directly, the way he seemed to ask about everything, without the careful diplomatic hedging she was used to from people who knew exactly how dangerous she was. "You haven't slept." "Not even a little. Not once since I found you." "I don't sleep. Everyone sleeps. Not warriors of the Dominion. Not if they can help it. Not without guards." She heard how it sounded even as she said it, heard the superstition in it, dressed up as discipline, and some old, tired part of her almost wanted him to laugh at it, because at least then it would be a small thing, a foolish thing, instead of the enormous and terrible fact it actually was. He did not laugh. "Tell me," he said instead, and sat back against the buckled wall beside her, closer than propriety technically allowed, and waited. So she told him. About the unrest. About the dead who could not fully die because their duty had not been fully discharged, and who searched, endlessly, patiently, across every generation, for the moment a warrior's guard came down far enough to let them in. About soldiers she had commanded, good soldiers, brave soldiers, who had died in her service and whom she had failed to bring home, and how she believed, not feared, believed, with the flat certainty of doctrine, that they were waiting for her, in the dark behind her own closed eyes, with questions she did not have answers for. Jonah listened to all of it without interrupting, which she had not expected. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I can't tell you that's not true," he said finally. "I don't know your gods or your ghosts. Wouldn't be my place to say they're not real just because I've never met one." He turned to look at her, and in the last dying light of the glowstick his eyes were steady in a way that had nothing to do with medical training. "But I can tell you that if anything comes for you tonight, it's going to have to get through me first. I mean that. I don't have a weapon and I've got one working arm worth trusting, but it'll have to get through me. You are one exhausted human medic with a torn shoulder," Vaelira said. "You could not stop a determined child, let alone the unrest." "Probably not," Jonah agreed easily. "But you'd be surprised what a person can do when they've already decided they're not moving. It should not have worked. It was, by any rational measure, an absurd promise. An unarmed, wounded man offering to guard a soul from an army of ancient dead he did not believe in and could not see. Vaelira had faced down capital ships with less doubt than she felt looking at him in that moment. And yet, she closed her eyes. His hand found hers in the dark, without ceremony, without asking permission, simply there, warm and human and entirely too steady for a man who claimed he wasn't scared. She slept. For the first time in longer than she could remember. Longer, perhaps, than she had ever managed as an adult, she slept without nightmares. No faces of soldiers she had failed. No accusing silence of the dead. Only dark, and rest, and the distant, grounding pressure of a hand that did not let go. They were found on the fourth day, by a Cerithian salvage crew working the debris field ahead of the official recovery teams. Vaelira heard the cutting torches before she heard the voices, and when the wall finally came away and light. Real light, harsh and blue and wonderful, flooded into the space that had been their whole world for 3 days, she found she did not want to let go of Jonah's hand nearly as much as protocol demanded. She let go anyway. That was the first lesson of command, that duty came before want, always, without exception. "Commander Sorn," the salvage team leader said, snapping to something like attention even through his obvious shock at finding her alive. "We feared you'd been lost with the bridge crew." "I very nearly was," Vaelira said, and did not look at Jonah as she said it, though she was intensely aware of him being lifted onto a separate stretcher, already being spoken about, already being categorized, human, Earth Coalition, prisoner or asset, pending determination, in the clipped efficient language of a military bureaucracy that had no box on its forms for the man who kept the unrest away from me in the dark. "He is the medic who preserved my life," she added before they could carry him off toward whatever holding cell prisoners of war were typically kept in. "He is to be treated as a valuable asset of this vessel, not a captive. See to it personally." It was the truth, and it was also, she understood even as she said it, a lie of omission large enough to hide a warship inside. The Dominion flagship Ashvale had a medical wing 3 decks below the command tower, all polished chrome and low blue light, staffed by physicians who treated Vaelira's return from presumed death with the brisk professional relief of people who had already begun drafting condolence reports. Jonah was given a cot in the same wing. Under guard, technically, though the guards seemed less interested in preventing his escape than in simply satisfying the paperwork requirement that a human aboard a Dominion warship be watched by someone. Vaelira returned to being who she was supposed to be almost immediately. Within a day she was back in the command tower, cold and precise and utterly untouchable, issuing orders about the Crown of Ashes salvage and the redistribution of her surviving crew with the same flat authority she had wielded for 11 years. If anyone noticed that their commander looked at the medical wing's lower decks slightly too often during status briefings, no one said so aloud. She told herself, the first night, that she was simply confirming the asset's condition remained stable. It was a commander's duty to verify the well-being of anyone she had personally vouched for. She told herself, walking down to the medical wing at an hour when no reasonable inspection needed to occur, that she wished to ask him a technical question about human recovery protocols, in case the information proved useful for future engagements. She told herself, on the third night, standing outside his door with no excuse prepared at all, nothing. Couldn't sleep? Jonah asked, when she finally came in. He was sitting up on the cot, not remotely surprised to see her, which irritated her more than it should have. I came to inspect your shoulder, she said. The reconstruction I performed was improvised. I wish to confirm it is healing correctly. Jonah said, and there was that almost smile again, the one she was coming to recognize as specifically, infuriatingly his. It's healing fine. Your doctor's already checked twice today. Then I will check a third time. He let her. He did not point out how unnecessary it was, or how her hands lingered on his shoulder considerably longer than any medical inspection required, or how she sat, afterward, on the edge of his cot instead of leaving, staring at the middle distance with the particular exhausted stillness of someone who had not slept properly in 3 days. You still haven't slept, he said quietly. Since the wreck? I do not require. Vaelira. It was the first time he had used her name without her rank attached to it, and something in her chest did something complicated and unfamiliar when he said it. You slept fine when I was holding your hand in a collapsed hallway that was actively losing oxygen. What's different now? Everything is different now, she wanted to say. Now there are officers who will see. Now there are consequences that did not exist in a dying ship where survival was the only law that mattered. What she said instead was, nothing is different. Jonah reached over, without asking, and took her hand. She did not pull away. She stayed until she fell asleep sitting upright at the edge of his cot, and when she woke before dawn and slipped back to her own quarters before the medical staff's shift change, she told herself it was the last time. It was not the last time. The excuses did not survive contact with the third week. Vaelira ran out of inspections to perform, questions to ask, wounds to check that had long since finished healing. She stopped inventing reasons entirely, and simply began appearing in the medical wing each night at the same hour, and Jonah simply began expecting her, and the two of them settled, without ever discussing it aloud, without either of them naming what it was, into something that looked, from the outside, uncomfortably like a routine two people in love might keep. It could not last as a secret. Nothing aboard a warship of 1,100 crew ever did. It was Dreven, General Dreven, her second in command, a warrior of impeccable lineage and even more impeccable ambition, who first raised it formally, in a private briefing that Vaelira had assumed would concern supply logistics. The human, Dreven said without preamble, sleeps 3 decks below your quarters, Commander, and yet your quarters have gone unused for the better part of a month. My sleeping arrangements are not a matter for this briefing. They are precisely the matter for this briefing, Dreven said, when the commander of the Dominion's flagship cannot close her eyes without a human's hand in hers. Do you imagine the crew has not noticed the medical wing's nightly visitor log? Do you imagine I have not noticed? Vaelira held his gaze without flinching, which was, she had learned over 11 years of command, the only currency that mattered in conversations like this one. He preserved my life, she said. I owe him a debt that has not yet been repaid. You owe him nothing that requires this, Dreven said. There is a word, among the old warriors, for what happens when a soul becomes entangled with something outside itself in the hours it should be shielded. They do not call it romance, Commander. They call it compromise. You are speaking of superstition. I am speaking of doctrine that has kept this Dominion's warriors alive for 1,000 years. Dreven said, his voice climbing towards something that was not quite insubordination but stood close enough to touch it. And I am watching that doctrine erode in front of the entire fleet because our commander would rather be comforted by an alien than face her own dead like a warrior." The word landed exactly where he intended it to land. "You may leave, General," Vaelira said very quietly. Dreven left. But the accusation did not leave with him. It had already begun, she understood, to move through the ship the way rumor always did, faster than any official channel, and infinitely harder to command back into silence. She went to the medical wing that night anyway. She told Jonah none of it. Not Dreven's words, not the particular curdled fear that had settled in her chest since the briefing, but he read it off her face regardless, the way he seemed able to read her without her ever quite deciding to be read. "Something's wrong," he said. "Nothing is wrong, Vaelira. It is nothing that concerns you," she said, more sharply than she intended, and saw something flicker across his face. Not hurt exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular caution of a man recalibrating how much of himself was safe to offer someone who had just pulled away. She hated that she had put it there. She reached for his hand anyway, because some things were stronger than pride, and he let her take it, though he watched her with new questions in his eyes that neither of them spoke aloud. She slept. The nightmares stayed away, as they always did, when his hand was in hers. She did not tell him that the fact of it working, the fact of her needing it to work, was precisely the compromise Dreven had named. 3 weeks after the crown of ash was lost, Vaelira did the thing that made Dreven's accusation impossible to dismiss as rumor any longer. She formally requisitioned Jonah Vail's continued presence aboard the Ash Vail under the classification of essential medical personnel, citing his unmatched expertise in improvised battlefield trauma care and his direct role in preserving the life of a ranking officer. It was not strictly a lie. It was also not remotely the reason, and every officer who read the requisition order understood exactly what it actually meant. "You didn't have to do that," Jonah told her, the night the order was formalized, standing in the small quarters that had been assigned to him, proper quarters now, 1 deck above the medical wing, closer to her own command tower than any human prisoner or asset had ever been billeted before. "You could have just let me be transferred back to Coalition custody in a prisoner exchange. Gone back to my own fleet. Wouldn't have had to explain any of this to anyone. I am aware." "So why didn't you?" Vaelira looked at him for a long moment, at the stubborn, steady, entirely too perceptive man who had held her hand in a dying ship and asked nothing in return, who had never once treated her fearsome reputation as anything more than a fact to be worked around, the way a doctor worked around a difficult wound. "Because I have spent 11 years believing that strength meant needing nothing," she said. "And you are the only thing in 11 years that has made me question whether that was ever true, or whether it was simply the shape fear takes when a warrior is too afraid to examine it." It was, for Vaelira Sorn, an extraordinary admission. She watched it land on him, watched something in his face open in response to it, and when he crossed the small distance of the room and kissed her, carefully, as though she might still, after everything, decide to pull away, she did not. She kissed him back instead, and did not think once, in that moment, about General Dreven, or the unrest, or the 1,000 years of doctrine that had never once accounted for a hand like this one. She would think about all of it soon enough. But not tonight. It did not stay contained to whispers for long. Within a month, the entire fleet knew, not through any formal announcement, but through the slow, corrosive spread of gossip that no command structure had ever successfully suppressed. Officers who had once looked at Vaelira with unquestioning respect now looked at her with something more complicated, not quite disrespect, not yet, but a kind of watchful reassessment, as though they were waiting to see how far the compromise would go before it became something that endangered them all. Dreven did not let the reassessment rest quietly. He cultivated it, carefully, the way a gardener cultivates rot. Not with open accusation, which Vaelira could have countered, but with suggestion. A comment here, about how the commander's tactical decisions in the last 3 engagements had grown cautious, uncharacteristically so. A remark there, About how a soul entangled with something outside the Dominion could not be trusted to act purely in the Dominion's interest when the moment demanded sacrifice. None of it was strictly false. Vaelira had grown more cautious. She found herself calculating risk differently than she once had, weighing losses in a way that accounted, however unconsciously, for the fact that somewhere aboard this ship was a man whose safety mattered to her more than any tactical doctrine had ever prepared her to admit. It was Jonah who noticed the change first, and Jonah who raised it, on a night 3 months into their arrangement, with the same blunt honesty he brought to everything. "You're distracted," he said. "In the command briefings. I've been in the room for 2 of them now, and you're second-guessing calls you'd have made instantly before the crown of ash." "I am not. Vaelira. I watch people for a living. It's my whole job. You're distracted, and I think it's because of me, and I think you know it too." She did not deny it a second time. That, more than anything, told him how right he was. "Dreven believes you have bound my spirit," she said instead, low. "That you have compromised something in me that the Dominion cannot survive without. I have spent 3 months telling myself he is wrong. I am no longer certain. So what, you're gonna send me away? Pretend the last 3 months didn't happen?" "I am considering," Vaelira said, and the words cost her more than she expected them to. "Whether loving you is a debt I can afford to keep paying, when the price may be paid by people who are not you and not me. My crew. My command. Everything I have spent 11 years building." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost none of its steadiness, but something in it had gone very careful, very deliberate, the voice of a man choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon. "That's your call to make," he said. "I'm not gonna tell you I know better than you do what your command needs. But I want you to actually ask yourself something, before you decide anything. Is it me that's making you cautious? Or is it you finally letting yourself care about something enough to be scared of losing it, and calling that fear my fault because it's easier than calling it yours?" She did not have an answer for him that night. She left without one, and for the first time since the wreck of the Crown of Ash, she did not return to his quarters before she slept. The nightmares came back immediately, and they were worse than she remembered. Full of the soldiers she had failed, their faces indistinct now with faces she had not lost yet, faces that looked, in the particular cruelty of dreams, disturbingly like Jonah's. She pulled away for 11 days. It was, she told herself, the responsible choice, the choice a commander made when a private attachment had begun to visibly compromise the confidence of her fleet. She threw herself into the Ashfiles operations with the ferocity of a woman trying to outrun something, reviewing every tactical decision twice, sitting in on briefings she would once have delegated, sleeping, or attempting to, alone, in her own quarters, guarded once again by the chemical regulators and armed sentries that Dominion doctrine had always considered sufficient. They were not sufficient. She had known, somewhere beneath the part of her that still insisted on trying, that they would not be. 3 months of Jonah's hand in the dark had taught her body something that 11 years of training had never managed to teach it, what safety actually felt like. Without it, the unrest did not merely visit her dreams. They occupied them, relentless, wearing the faces of every soldier she had lost across 11 years of command, asking the same unanswerable question in 100 different voices. "Why did you let us go, when you would not let him go too?" She woke each morning more exhausted than the last. Her officers noticed. Dreven, watching her hollow-eyed arrival at the 6th consecutive dawn briefing, said nothing. But the small, satisfied set of his mouth told her exactly what he believed he was watching, proof, finally, that separating the commander from her human weakness had restored her to something closer to the warrior the Dominion required. He was wrong. She was not restored to anything. She was simply drowning more quietly than before, in a way that looked, from the outside, like discipline. Jonah did not seek her out during those 11 days. She understood, distantly, that this was its own kind of gift, that a lesser man would have pushed, would have made her choice harder by refusing to accept it, and instead he simply let her have the space she had claimed she needed, even as she watched him grow quieter himself, watched something careful and wounded settle into the way he looked at her the rare times their paths crossed in the corridors. On the 11th night, she stood outside his quarters for nearly 20 minutes before she made herself knock. He opened the door already knowing, somehow, what she would say before she said it, that particular gift he had for reading her that she had never once managed to fully guard against. "I cannot do this," she said. "Being without you is destroying something in me that I do not know how to name. But being with you is destroying something else. The trust of every soldier who serves beneath me. I do not know how a warrior is supposed to choose between those two forms of ruin." "Maybe," Jonah said quietly, "the warrior isn't supposed to choose. Maybe the warrior's supposed to prove the choice was never real to begin with." "How?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know 11 days of you not sleeping hasn't fixed a single thing Dreven's worried about. It's just made you tired and miserable instead of tired and in love. I don't see how that's supposed to be the responsible option." Despite everything, despite 11 days of grief dressed up as duty, Vaelira felt something in her chest crack open into something almost like a laugh. "You are not permitted to make sense at a moment like this," she said. "Somebody's gotta," Jonah said, and reached for her hand, and, for the first time in 11 days, she let him take it. She did not have an answer that night either. But she slept, and the unrest stayed where they belonged, and in the morning she woke with something that felt, for the first time since Dreven's briefing, less like fear and more like resolve. Dreven moved 3 weeks later, during the coalition peace negotiations that had brought both fleets, Dominion and Earth, into orbit around the neutral station Halcyon Reach. It was, in retrospect, the perfect moment for him to act. The eyes of both governments were on the negotiations, which meant Vaelira's attention was divided, her guard occupied with diplomatic protocol rather than the internal politics of her own command deck. Dreven had spent months cultivating support among officers who shared his conviction, some sincerely believing the old doctrine, others simply seeing opportunity in a commander weakened by scandal. And on the second night of negotiations, while Vaelira was in a closed session with the coalition delegation, he made his move. Jonah was taken from his quarters by 4 of Dreven's loyalists, restrained, and brought to the flagship's central hangar bay, the largest open space aboard the Ashvale, and, not coincidentally, the space with the best sidelines for an audience. Dreven's message, relayed to Vaelira through a channel he made certain the entire command deck could hear, was simple and devastating in its simplicity. The human dies publicly, tonight, and the commander's soul is freed from his corruption. Or the commander watches her fleet fracture beneath her while she decides whether one alien life is worth 1,000 years of doctrine. Vaelira left the negotiation table without a word of explanation to the stunned coalition delegates. She did not run. A commander did not run, not where cameras and witnesses could see. But she walked the length of the Ashvale faster than she had walked anywhere in 11 years of command, and by the time she reached the hangar bay, Dreven had assembled perhaps 200 crew as witnesses, and Jonah was on his knees at the center of the floor, hands bound, a single guard's blade resting at the back of his neck. He looked up when she entered. He did not look afraid. Or if he was, he did not let it show, which she understood now, watching him, was simply who he was, a man who had decided, in a collapsed corridor months ago, that he would not move, and who had apparently never once reconsidered that decision. "Commander," Dreven said, with mocking formality, "I had hoped you would arrive in time to witness this yourself, rather than hear of it second-hand. It seemed important that you understand precisely what is being done, and why." "Release him," Vaelira said. "Now, General, and I will consider this insubordination rather than mutiny, which is the only mercy I intend to offer you." "You misunderstand your position," Dreven said. "This is not insubordination. This is the fleet, Commander. 200 officers who have watched their commander unmake herself for the sake of an alien's hand in the dark, and who have finally decided that the doctrine of 1,000 years matters more than the comfort of one compromised soul. I am not defying you. I am saving you, whether you have the clarity left to see it. Vaelira looked at the 200 faces arrayed around the hangar bay, soldiers she had led into battle, soldiers whose names she knew, whose families she had written condolences to when the war took them, soldiers who had once followed her without question and now watched her with the particular wariness of people deciding whether their faith had been misplaced. She could have fought. She was, by a considerable margin, the most dangerous warrior aboard this ship, and a part of her, the part trained across 11 years to solve every threat with decisive violence, calculated, instantly, exactly how she would disarm the guard at Jonah's neck, how many of Dreven's loyalists she could put down before the numbers turned against her. She did not reach for that solution. Instead, she did something that cost her considerably more than violence ever could have. She told the truth, in front of every witness Dreven had assembled to watch her destroyed. "You believe," she said, her voice carrying across the hangar bay without need of amplification, "that this human bound my spirit? That he stole something from me the moment I let his hand keep the unrest away in the wreck of the Crown of Ash? I understand why you believe it. I believed something like it myself, for months, and it cost me 11 sleepless nights and every ounce of certainty I once possessed." She turned slowly, taking in the full width of the assembled crew. "But you are wrong. He did not steal my strength. He gave me something I did not know I was permitted to have, enough safety, for the first time in my life, to stop fighting even for a few hours in the dark. Our doctrine tells us that fearlessness means the guard never comes down. That a warrior's worth is measured by how much she can carry alone, forever, without ever setting it down. I believed that doctrine for 11 years. I have watched it hollow out soldier after soldier, watched good warriors become husks who could not close their eyes without seeing the dead, because we taught them that needing anyone at all was the same as weakness." She looked, finally, at Jonah, kneeling, bound, a blade at his neck, watching her with an expression that held no fear for himself at all, only a fierce and steady pride that made something in her chest ache. "I say to you now, in front of every witness General Dreven has gathered to watch me condemned, real courage is not the absence of vulnerability. Real courage is trusting someone enough to become defenseless beside them, and choosing, every single night, to do it again. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing I have done in 11 years of command, braver than any battle I have won, because a battle only asks you to risk your life. This asked me to risk being known." The hangar bay was silent. 200 soldiers, trained across their whole lives to believe exactly what Dreven believed, stood absolutely still, and Vaelira understood that this single, terrible, unguarded moment would either break her command entirely, or remake it into something stronger than doctrine had ever managed to build. "General Dreven," she said, turning back to him, "you have called this mutiny a mercy. I call it the last act of a man too afraid of his own vulnerability to imagine that mine could be a strength instead of a wound. Release him. This ends now, one way or another." Dreven did not release him. Instead, his hand went to the blade himself, some final, desperate calculation deciding, in the space of a single heartbeat, that the only way to salvage his mutiny was to finish it before Vaelira's words could finish unraveling the loyalty he had spent months building. He did not manage it. Vaelira crossed the hangar bay faster than 200 witnesses could track, faster than Dreven's guard could react, and the blade that had rested at Jonah's neck a moment before was in her hand instead, and Dreven was on the ground with her boot planted against his chest before anyone in the hangar bay had fully processed that the confrontation had become physical at all. It was, in the end, a shorter fight than either of them expected. Dreven was skilled. He had not risen to general without genuine ability, but he had spent his ambition on politics and whispers rather than the kind of relentless, focused violence that had made Vaelira the most feared commander in the Dominion. And within moments the fight was no longer a fight at all, only a formality being concluded. "Yield," Vaelira said, the blade at his throat now, "or I finish what your mutiny started, and no one in this hangar bay will call it anything but justice. Dreven yielded. His guards, watching their leader defeated in seconds by the commander they had just watched confess to loving a human, made no move to intervene, and in their stillness, Vaelira understood that the tide in the hangar bay had already turned before the fight had even finished. She could have executed him. Dominion law permitted it, demanded it, in fact, for mutiny of this severity, and every officer watching would have accepted the sentence without protest. She did not. "You will be stripped of rank," she said instead, stepping back, lowering the blade. "You will be confined for the remainder of this campaign, and you will answer for this before a formal tribunal upon our return to Dominion space. But I will not kill you, General, and I want every witness in this hangar bay to understand exactly why. Because I have spent this entire evening arguing that mercy and vulnerability are not weakness, and I do not intend to prove myself a hypocrite in the same breath I finish making the argument. Breaking the cycle you tried to use against me does not end with more of the same violence you were so certain I could not survive without." She turned to Jonah, still kneeling, still bound, watching her with an expression she did not have words for yet, and crossed the remaining distance herself to cut the restraints from his wrists with her own hands, in front of every witness who remained. "Are you injured?" she asked, low, for him alone. "Nothing that won't heal," Jonah said. His voice was steady, but his hands, when they found hers, were shaking. The first real fear he had shown all evening, arriving now, safely, in the aftermath, the way fears so often did. "You didn't have to do that. The mercy. You could have just—" "I know exactly what I did not have to do," Vaelira said. "I did it because it was right, and because you have spent months teaching me, without ever once intending to, that strength and softness were never actually opposites. I am done pretending otherwise, General Dreven's opinion notwithstanding." Around them, slowly, the assembled crew began to move again, not toward violence, not toward further mutiny, but toward something that looked, unmistakably, like the first uncertain steps of soldiers reconsidering a doctrine that had governed their entire lives, watching their commander choose vulnerability in front of them and remain, unmistakably, exactly as formidable as she had always been. The negotiations with the Earth Coalition concluded 4 days later, and history would record accurately, though incompletely, that the peace accords signed aboard Halcyon Reach marked the formal end of hostilities between the Dominion and the Coalition after years of costly war. What history would not record, because it belonged to no formal document, was the smaller peace that had been negotiated in the Ashvile's hangar bay on the second night of talks, the one between Vaelira Sorn and the doctrine she had spent 11 years believing without question. In the days that followed the mutiny, she found herself approached, quietly, by officers who would never have dared such a conversation before, young warriors mostly, soldiers who had grown up beneath the same crushing doctrine that had governed her own childhood, who asked her, carefully, as though testing whether the question itself was permitted, whether it was true, what she had said in the hangar bay. Whether a warrior really could rest without a guard beside her, and remain a warrior at all. She did not have a simple answer for any of them. But she found, increasingly, that she did not need one, that it was enough, some days, to simply tell them the truth, that she had spent 11 years afraid of exactly this question, and that the fear had cost her more sleep, more nightmares, more hollowed-out nights than the vulnerability she had finally allowed herself ever had. Dreven's tribunal was scheduled for their return to Dominion space. Whatever verdict awaited him there, Vaelira understood that his mutiny had already failed in the way that mattered most. Rather than proving her compromised, it had forced her to prove, in front of the entire fleet, precisely how much strength her vulnerability actually contained. The Ashvale set course for Dominion space 3 weeks after the peace accords were signed, carrying with it a commander whose reputation had, against every prediction Dreven had made, only grown, not despite the mutiny, but somehow through it, as the story of the hangar bay confrontation spread through the fleet in the particular unstoppable way that true stories always did, gathering weight and meaning with each retelling. Jonah remained aboard, his status no longer requiring careful bureaucratic euphemism. He had been offered, through official coalition channels, the choice to return to Earth service now that the war's end made prisoner exchanges and reassignments possible again. He had declined, quietly, without ceremony, in a conversation with Vaelira that neither of them made into more of a moment than it needed to be, because both of them had already understood, long before it was spoken aloud, exactly what his answer would be. It was 3 months after Halcyon Reach. The ash veiled deep in transit through quiet space, the mutiny and its tribunal both concluded, Dreven stripped of rank and reassigned to a distant outpost where his ambition could do considerably less damage, that Jonah woke in the middle of the ship's long artificial night to find Vaelira standing silently at the edge of his bed. He had grown accustomed, across the better part of a year now, to the particular quality of her silence when something troubled her. The stillness of a woman deciding how much of herself was safe to show. "Nightmare?" he asked, sitting up, already reaching for her hand out of pure habit before he'd fully surfaced from sleep himself. "No," Vaelira said. He paused, hand still extended, waiting. "I did not have a nightmare," she said again, and there was something in her voice he had not heard there before. Not the careful discipline of the commander, not the guarded vulnerability of the woman who had spent months learning to trust him. Something simpler than either. "I simply did not wish to face the night alone. There was no fear that required your hand this time. Only a wish for it." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. The most feared warrior in the Dominion, standing quietly beside his bed in the small hours of a ship's artificial night, having crossed the distance between them not out of need this time, but out of choice, plain and unguarded and entirely her own. "That's the best reason you've given me yet," he said, and took her hand. She came to sit beside him, and then, after a moment, to lie down beside him properly, her head against his shoulder, his hand still in hers, and for the first time in the long strange arc of everything that had brought them here, the wreck, the medical wing, the mutiny, the tribunal, she was not there because she required treatment, or because doctrine demanded a guard against the unrest, or because Dreven's accusations had left her too proud to admit what she needed. She was there because it was where she had chosen to feel safe. Because somewhere across 11 months and one collapsed corridor, and a hangar bay full of witnesses, safety had stopped being a weakness she needed to hide, and become, instead, simply a fact about her life that she no longer needed anyone's permission to claim. Outside the small quarters, the ash veil carried them onward through the quiet dark, toward Dominion space, toward whatever peace still needed building between two peoples who had spent generations at war. But inside, in the small warm space of a shared bed, none of that mattered yet. There was only the dark, and the steady sound of his breathing, and her hand in his, and, for the first time in a life spent guarding against exactly this, no fear left in her at all. She slept.